Hi, everyone. I can't believe it's the end of 2021. We just finished practice groups, Derek and I, just about 15 minutes ago. So practice groups for the fall is over. So everybody stand by in the new year to get news about all the happenings in the spring. We are taking a little break. I am going to South Africa in a hot second after this meeting. But as always, Stephen holds the fort while Derek and I are in a short break in South Africa. And Stephen is just going to fill you in quickly about what's happening with Matinee for the rest of December and in January.
That is correct. Let me get my list up here. On December the 19th, a week from today, we will celebrate, since it's almost Christmas, a bel canto Christmas with mostly rather older recordings of some Christmas favorites and some surprising selections. On December 26th, I will hopefully, fingers crossed, be in Buenos Aires. So we will feature singers of the Teatro Colón. I apologize for my barking dog. He's going crazy today. On January the 2nd, there will be a break, no matinee, just recover from your celebrations on January 1st and the 31st of December. So no matinee on January 2nd. On Sunday, January the 9th, it's French singers in a program I'm calling Vive la France. January 16th, the program is the Strauss Soprano. Really sopranos, but the Strauss soprano voice. January 23rd will be Singers of La Scala. And January the 30th will be an all Mozart program to tie in with something that Derek's going to tell you about. And that's the rundown.
Yes. That weekend, January 29th and 30th, Will be joining us for part of it, but Rochelle and I will be doing a seminar on Mozart, and our angle on what is historically informed and research confirmed Mozart performance practice. So we have assembled a lot of reading material that is at the very secret, complicated link, belcantobootcamp.com/Mozart. You might click on something and it might not open yet, but it will by the end of today. But it should all be collated there. So please avail yourself of those reading resources over your Christmas break, where you can't decide what to watch on Netflix. You can learn about some Italian opera.
Yes, so this is to celebrate like what will be a whole spring full of Mozart. We are concentrating on Mozart and what we have learned from Wakai to bring to our Mozart. I'm excited that Will is going to join us, and in an hour of guest speaking about how we know that Mozart liked portamento. So you all know that you want to hear that lecture because we're all tired of non-legato Mozart. And then we will hit all of the topics. It's really important that you do your homework. See, like I go on break and I give you homework. This is how it works, like at BCBC, because Derek and I don't want to spend like countless hours like talking. Basically during the seminar we're going to practice where the appoggiatores go. We're going to practice ornamentation and things like that and answer questions. So a lot of this research you have seen before during the Wakai project, but this is not just kind of like all of the Mozart pulled together in one place to kind of organize your mind. We will, by the end of this coming week, definitely also put out the program for that weekend so that you know exactly what's happening. So that is all of the housekeeping, and we are thrilled to have back Will Crutchfield and Conrad Osborne for part 2 of our discussion about opera as opera. These gentlemen need very little introduction to this crowd. Will has been my friend, mentor, colleague for many, many years. I met Conrad through Will, and there are few things in the world like more exciting than hearing the two of them talk. So over to them. Oh, Will, I muted you, and also Conrad, if you can just unmute. There you go.
All right. All right. Am I heard
I
now?
just got home.
Yeah, you can hear me?
And what?
Can everybody just please check
The bus
that
what?
good guests, Nicholas Simpson, who else? Okay, I will go through the room and make sure everybody is muted.
Right. Before I can know exactly how I should introduce today's topic with Conrad, I would like very much to know how many of you attending here have actually read his chapter on singing from opera as opera. Don't be shy and don't pretend you've read it if you haven't, but would you use the hand raising function and raise your hand if you have read it? Okay, going. Gone. Okay, several of you have, and that is great, but several of you also haven't. So I am going to explain a little bit about what that chapter is. Today's topic, the new vocality, is a small part of a big book. And what Conrad does in the chapter that is specially devoted to singing in his opera as opera book is really a kind of tour de force of gathering and explaining an enormous body of information. It starts with bits and pieces of what is known about operatic vocalism in the centuries before recording and focusing our attention on certain developments associated with the rise of the core operatic repertory in the 19th century that made opera the central cultural thing it became. And then confronting the entire oral record of the 20th century and drawing from this overwhelming mass of evidence certain coherent themes and progressions, things that happened, how they happened, and why they happened, to which I cannot possibly do justice in any short summary, though it needs to be read in detail to get a full grasp of the issues at stake. But I can give you one little idea of the tools he brings to this. I'm going to share my screen for a moment and show you along the way of his tracing, he sometimes isolates certain singers as exemplars of a particular stage in development or a particular type of vocalism. And I have put the three lists on the screen here. If you know these singers, simply seeing them listed in a certain order or in certain apposition will intrigue you. And if there are names in it that you haven't heard, you'll be thrilled and intrigued to get to know them. But the progression he traces is, among other things, one of a motion from bright to dark, or lean to plump, or taut to loose, or from what he calls the tensile mezza voce to something, this is not quite a parallel, that he calls the easy plush version of legato singing, from chest registration to head registration. I am not trying to give you a summary, but trying to evoke some of the themes and progressions that he deals with. He then brings it all down to its destination point in what he calls the new vocality, which is our topic today and is also the world we live in. And I think it would be fair, although nothing is fair but actually reading the chapter, but I think it would be fair to say in a very rough summary that the new vocality is characterized for Conrad by voices that are smaller, headier, more loosely engaged, blander in tonal color. As you can imagine, he is not a fan of the new vocality. He associates this new paradigm, again, I'm generalizing here, but he associates it with two areas of modern repertory interest: the Baroque and classical works that preceded the core operatic repertory, and the various experiments and variations in the 20th century that followed that repertory. and he concedes the achievement of certain skills favorable to those branches of repertory, and notes a distinct shortfall in their ability to function within the non-skipped repertory, the core 19th century repertory. He coins the term skip over for the kind of singer who functions mostly in Baroque music and certain kinds of modern music. But it doesn't stop there, because he also concludes that the service rendered to those repertories by the new vocality is essentially superficial, costing much more in what we might call core impact and appeal than it gains in the cultivation of certain external skills. And so I'm going to read one little excerpt that took a lot of explanation to get to. He then detours back to list some of the glorious Wagner and Verdi singers who regularly performed Mozart and Gluck in the beginning of the 20th century, composers in whom we rarely hear the great, or whatever Wagner and Verdi singers we now have. And so after listing some of these casts, he writes the following: "But think of how the music must have resounded. Think of the beauty, richness, and amplitude of those voices, and of the stature such voices must have lent to the characters of those dramas. That is a radically different perspective from which to consider the desirability of performance practice niceties. And while one is at liberty to fantasize such voices bent to skip over purposes, the fact is that once a very short distance along that road has been traveled, one no longer has such voices." Now, this is Conrad in his mode as an Old Testament prophet, and I think he's exactly on target here. I'm going to take up just exactly 2 minutes more of this time to surprise Conrad with something, and what I think might be a good kickoff for the discussion in the form of a very rough oral demonstration of some of these contrasts. It is a short group of operatic phrases, operatic or classical phrases. I promise it's only 2 minutes long. And in each case, the second iteration of the phrase in question is sung in what I think is an example of the new vocality. I'm not identifying these singers because, but I will say that in every single case, I am not picking on nobodies here. In every single case, they are A house, first night of new production, major recording contract with a major label singers. So they are the proudest representatives of the new vocality. And here are the phrases. I don't know if you can see all 10 of them, but there they are. And here goes our 2-minute romp through them.
Bella come un angelo, bella come un angelo, mein Bächlein will ich fragen, mein Bächlein will ich fragen, il l'aria di
Okay, there goes. Conrad, is that the new vocality?
That's terrific, Will. I'm putting those together and little fragments where you hear just so distinctly the loss of engagement and I don't know whether you intended it this way or not, but also the introduction of moony little effects, attempts to interpret, because the need of that is felt to produce something expressive, as opposed to, for example, a little line from Regnava. Instead of a firm, clear, steady thing that's just rendering the music and the words with tremendous clarity, and then a good modern soprano, not a bad modern soprano, doing extra little moves. You can like them if you want to, it's okay, but they substitute for that just ongoing, good, clear, efficient engagement with the voice. And to me, that these are wonderful illustrations, Will, and they get across a lot of the point that I was making very, very clearly. It's been just basically a kind of a cop-out on a collapse of the intention of just pursuing from one note to another, one bar to another, and the ability to do so. Yeah, that's great.
How come?
How come? I do talk about that in the book some, and I've talked about it in some episodes of my blog also, extracts called Before the First Lesson. I think now there are 4 of them, or maybe 5, I'm not sure, and there should be more, because each one of them examines some aspect of what has happened over the course of the 20th and now the early 21st century to contribute to this loss of vocal engagement, or as I sometimes put it, just laryngeal energization, simply the directing of energy into the origins of the vocal process and the ability of those coordinations to respond in a healthy, ongoing, sustained way. So I don't know which of them to pick. I mean, one of the ones that I know you and I will have often talked about is simply and obviously the introduction of the microphone. And I might, if I could back up just a moment, the charts that Will showed you and the route that I trace from what I call left column singers, the ones who were bright, lean, and taut, to ones that are darker, plumper, and looser. That general route, with of course exceptions, not every singer can be defined that way, and always the greatest singers are somewhere on the midline. They're not discernibly to one side or the other. They're combining both of all of those capabilities, the chiaroscuro and anyway. Where was I leading with that? Despite that move that I think is pretty clear if you do enough listening, of voices that still may have been very capable, but that there was a general shift from those left column, leaner, tauter, etc., over toward the right column, which produced so many voluminous voices. And what I should emphasize is that by the end of the Second World War, which is just where I came in terms of any kind of aware listening and all of that, and opera going, hearing voices live. We still had, in that first generation after the Second World War, 1945 to roughly 1970, that quarter century, we still had a lot of good, big, healthy voices around, and a lot of good lyrical voices that weren't intended for the big dramatic roles and didn't have to go there, but whose voices were still grounded and clear and steady of all categories. So that we had still sort of the hierarchy of performance in place in terms of vocal format. People whose voices could take on the major roles, dramatic roles of the 19th century repertoire, and others who could capably take on the lighter, more lyrical roles, in which they could still be heard and their voices could still be tracked, even though they might be slender sounds. Alfredo Kraus is an obvious example among tenors, but you could pick some out from any category. Anyway, we still did have that in those years, ending sometime in the very early 1970s. When that generation faded away, the generation that had been born by and large in the days just when the microphone was coming into existence, but who were brought up with acoustical voice in most cases, in most circumstances. If you went to church, the preacher or the priest was speaking out acoustically. If you went to a political rally down Cooper Union or someplace, the person was holding forth acoustically. So the overall general uses of voice and what got into those singers' ears very early on, very early, maybe in the womb for all I know, but certainly very shortly thereafter, was a different assumption about what a voice was expected to be able to do and the kind of energy that you were required to put into it. Will and I have talked a number of times about the training in rhetoric that used to take place in schools. Everybody had to do it. You had to stand up and recite. And if you couldn't be heard, you were told you can't be heard. So all that was still hanging in there in a major way. Other things had deteriorated a bit. It had become already quite a bit more homogenized in terms of national ethnic identities in singing. The schools of singing that came from each of the great European national ethnic traditions had become somewhat blurred and, of course, Americanized. But we still had that. We still had the capability of having performances of the 19th century repertoire satisfactorily and sometimes very excitingly sung. What's happened since then, what Will is getting at about the new vocality, is that from that sort of right column but still filled out kind of voice, we have somehow executed a sort of withdrawal. I think the microphone has continued to play a big part in that. People who have grown up with nothing but amplified sound, conveyed sound, electrically conveyed sound, and they just have no conception, basically, as people growing up, of what it means to energize the voice in that way. So I think that's still a major component. I think changes in social attitudes, the way the sexes present to each other. One of the things you can say about the old definitions is that they were extremely defined in terms of that. Women were women and men were men. There was no question about it. There wasn't much, and there wasn't a pulling back from that. So changes in social attitudes and what is considered polite, correct, whatever, in the ways we just conduct ourselves generally. That's been part of it. There are some indications, this seems like a far out thing and certainly would have to any one of us 50 years ago, but there are signs that there are some actual changes in human flesh, that there is a weakening or devirilization going on that's environmentally related. There's some pretty good research backing that up. Not too many smoking guns found with respect to how it relates to opera, but enough there to make you say, huh, when you read about it. What else? There are plenty of other things, but those are.
Oh, go ahead. I was just I wanted to throw in there just something about that generation you talked about where because of what was in their ears and what the expectations were still around them, even though they lived in the age of the microphone, they had these filled out voices and they were celebrated for them, and that was still the expected thing. But many of the most elite made their reputations, perhaps principally, through produced studio recordings.
Right.
And I wonder whether you think that was within the category of voices that really could function well in the opera house, like Crespin or Vickers or whoever. Was there a tilt in favor of the ones that could perhaps prefigure the new vocality with their easy plush and so forth and so on, especially through recording?
Yes, I think so. On the one hand, the recordings that we had from the time of LP on particularly, and then from stereo on, about a 10-year differential there, were capable of capturing big voices in a way that older recordings had not been so much. You have to infer sometimes, especially when you get back into the acoustical era, about the actual presence of a lot of those voices, especially higher voices. So those recordings did bring us, I guess we could say, for the first fully satisfactory time, a pretty good sense of what some of these big-voiced singers were sounding like in an opera house. On the other hand, it was still recording, and it was increasingly recording with lots of post-production sweetening, with lots of retakes, all of that, which removes it a little bit more and more from what you can expect to hear in any given live performance. But yes, I think it paradoxically kind of, because while on the one hand it did capture those voices better than previous recording had, it also tended to favor voices that were keenly adaptable to microphone pickup. And I would cite even a voice as great as U.C. Bierling. One reason he sounds so wonderful on records, and I don't mean he didn't sound wonderful in the opera house, but that was not what we would think of as a dramatic format voice. He was what we thought of then as a lyric or lyrico spinto. There were certain roles in the spinto category that he could satisfyingly take on, but he was essentially a lyric tenor, an operatic lyric tenor, a slender voice derived from a Scandinavian practice linguistically, beautifully balanced and clean. So the microphone picks up all of that and doesn't pick up any of the surround of a voice as much, or the artifacts that might come into a big but somewhat imperfect voice. It catches those, but with a singer as clean as Bierling was. And of course, I'm citing a great tenor. It goes way down from there. And yes, it does begin to, that combined with the skip over thing that I talk about, the introduction of voices very suitably adapted to a lot of earlier music and some contemporary music, but not at all adapted to, that begins to affect everything. It begins to affect vocal pedagogy, certainly as taught in the schools. I might mention the chapter called "We Go to School" in my book, and I'm not slamming everybody who works in academic pedagogy. My sympathies are with them. The conditions that they often work under and the expectations they're intended to meet, and the ones they're not intended to meet, and the bias that tends to go into voices through our whole system of academic training, then into the associate programs. We've talked about this before in the video series. So that combined with the getting into everybody's ear in a kind of a subliminal way, it doesn't, that the microphone, when you sing into a microphone, That's a different experience than singing into the hall, and the microphone picks up things a little bit differently than the human ear does out in the auditorium. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that did become an influence.
Let me steer it to another thing that is very strongly traced in the book, including in other parts of the book. It seems to me that the microphone alone can't completely explain it when there is also this factor of an apparent desire to escape from the big, openly expressed out there hetero passions of the core 19th century repertory, and to seek out operatic works that express irony or that deconstruct societal norms, or that that in some way or other set themselves in opposition to the romanticism, to the idealism, to the tragic, the sense of tragic catharsis, and that critiques those modes of experience and finds them hollow or pretentious or perhaps calculated to support the patriarchy and keep the colonials in their place, or all of that other stuff. That basic move. I mean, we seem to want such operas now, and maybe that's why we also seem to want voices that are not potent, threatening, grand, dominant, etc. Is the operatic voice the dead white male turned into music?
And the dead white female as well. When we talk about the de-virilization of voice, we're not talking about just men. And, the way voice developed through the 19th century and into the early 20th century, obviously all before the microphone, and with the increase in the way operas were written and the size of the orchestras and somewhat the size of the opera houses. I think that's very much overdone as a factor, but nevertheless, it's in there to some extent. The way voices were developed to respond to that, and of course, you're in danger here of getting me started on my E19 protagonist couple narrative, the meta-narrative that I truly believe governs all of that storytelling over and over and over again. And it's essentially the same story. And yes, it is those things. And that's what makes up the operas of the Romantic and Veristic repertoires and their Germanic counterparts. So that's the dramatic engine that drives all of that. So if you had ceased to believe in that, or if you in some way object to it, or are scared by it, or whatever combination of, or just find it old-fashioned, dated, old hat, whatever, no longer, quote, relevant, unquote, the favorite term, then to the extent that people feel that way, there's going to be a movement away from the kinds of performance and, of course, production that actually render those pieces. And those become models. I mean, it's a thing that takes time. Didn't all happen at once. There are still exceptions to it, not many. But here we wind up with this combination of a great withdrawal from that older vocality, a reduction in it, if you want to use the word devirilization, you can, so long as we understand that testosterone is needed in female voices as well, and its resonantal equivalents and outcomes. Yes, for sure. I think that's part of a big social sea change. And in the book, I call it the flight from E19, as if it were something that beginning around the time of the First World War, everybody went running as fast as they could from that narrative. And it
Because that
rebelled.
narrative began to be seen as what threw the world into the horror of.
Correct, and perhaps not without some reason.
Right,
But this attachment of the cultural blame game attached to what are essentially political forces and social upheaval, that to me is kind of a misplaced way of pinning the tail on the donkey. But nevertheless, yes, that's right. So as that dramatic engine slowed down, sputtered, got shifted around. People, a couple of my blog posts recently, I've written about some of the efforts of the Verismo composers at Mascagni with Iris, for example. I'm doing a little thing on Turandot now, where people began reaching for other ways of looking at the story or evading the story altogether and going to something else, some other narrative. But they were unable to find one. They were unable to find one that both the artists and the audiences could agree on the importance of, on the significance to them in their lives. Because it was the artists feeling this that drove it, of course. We also into this habit of kind of, well, audience tastes have changed. No. The artists are supposed to lead. The artists are supposed to, the audiences will respond. And if today we brought back one of those great casts from even as recently as the 60s and put it out there in one of the standard repertory works, people would respond. Don't tell me they wouldn't. But
that show would sell out, yeah.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah.
And of course, most of the people would not be worrying about whether this is imperialist or not, or sexist or not, or whatever ism you want to put on it. They wouldn't be thinking about that at all. They would just be responding to the music making, the story making, the singing, acting.
I felt like I sort of saw this progression in the flesh one time many years ago, just after Peter Sellers produced his 3-part Mozart da Ponte cycle. I had a long sort of adversarial interview with him that I don't think it ever wound up appearing in the Times, but anyway, it took place. And in the course of it, I played him with the intent to challenge the kind of aesthetic that governed the musical performance in his productions. I played him a record of Ezio Pinza singing Mozart. And he said, it's just beautiful. I love it. Ezio Pinza serves no cultural purpose that I can imagine being worth pursuing.
Well,
no answer to that.
No, there is no answer to that. If your responses truly are that way, and if you think that the response you had just emotionally and aesthetically to his singing is somehow irrelevant to the social purpose that you see yourself as promoting, then you can't argue with it. It's just the premises are so far apart that there is no joining of the ground there.
Is it possible, Conrad, that opinion leaders in opera, power brokers and opinion leaders in opera have made choices that left the audience behind and starved it of what would in fact have been more pleasing to it?
I'm sorry, say it again. I was looking at a little thing on the screen.
Have the opinion leaders and power brokers in opera perhaps imposed some of this new aesthetic in the absence of actual audience desire for it and against the will of the audiences that would have preferred something that we too would have preferred? It looks like that question wasn't clear.
No, it is. I'm just thinking about, my first response is yes. I'm sure some of that has gone on. I also have empathy with these people because the pool of talent to draw on. You know, what if you did try to cast La Forza del Destino, or if the goal of pretend I'm Peter Gelb and I'm running the Metropolitan Opera, and I truly want to restore as much as I can the canon, and to nurture it and put it over to people, and I look around for the people who I think can do that. I think I have a problem, because I don't think there are many of them, and I think that's a very hard thing to do now, even if that's your intention. But I also think that it is often not the intention. I remember, did you read the little thing? It finally came out as an article in Opera magazine, maybe 10 to a dozen years ago. Andrew Moravchik, you know who he is? He's a social scientist, basically, at Princeton. He is politically involved, but he also, for a time, he's a big opera enthusiast. And for a time, he and a mob of, I gather, of graduate students that he enlisted from his social science people, did a big survey. They went to 125 opera professionals all over the world. I think you were one of them. I was one of them. Conductors, gatekeepers, agents, impresarios, singers themselves, teachers, coaches, ones that they got names of, that they had some prominence, both here and in Europe. And he just spent a lot of time asking them, first of all, do you really think that big voices have just gone away, that we don't have them anymore, we can't cast these operas? And secondly, why do you think that is? And of course, the universal response. I don't know that there were any demurrals from this. Well, nearly at least universal response. Well, yes, of course, everybody knows that. That's obvious. But some of the responses said, oh, we don't want good singing. He said a German intendant actually told him that. We don't want good singing. That's not what we're trying to do. So I take him at his word. He's trying to do something other than opera. Or he's trying to do something to opera that has nothing to do with good singing. So, I don't think he was the only one who gave a response kind of in that ballpark. Yes, you're right, that's gone away, but it's a new time now, we're adapting to it, and we believe we have better ways of doing these things anyway. So, and then there were other people who genuinely mourned it and just said, yes, what can we do? We can't mount these shows.
That brings us around to some things that are beginning to come in the chat. We have a lot of appreciative comments here, but some of them include actual questions, and I encourage everyone to make direct questions here, because I am
Please.
sort of, when I can, keeping up with the chat. From Jennifer Moore is, she raises the question of what opera is for. Is the primary purpose to make audiences feel something or to make them think something? And she says she would take the former over the latter, and says that the latter probably isn't worth much anyway, if not coupled with the former. So she's staking a vote in favor of making audiences feel something.
Well, sure. First of all, I talk about this a little bit in the book. It's to make you feel something so that you have something to think about. I mean, we talk about this in relation to Schoenberg, that very interesting essay he has on the heart and mind in music, and it's something he grappled with all his life, and tried or thought he was solving in his own music. If you don't have an emotional response in opera, for heaven's sake, where everything about the way it's organized, you got a big orchestra playing or even a small orchestra playing, you got people singing at you from off of a stage, all of that implies some kind of visceral energy connection from performers to the people receiving it. And if that doesn't stir something in you, which we call emotional, if that doesn't stir it, there's kind of no point to the art form, I think. I guess you can write totally intellectual operas that are intended only as thought pieces. In order to do that, you have to subtract almost everything from it that at least you and I value. But
It's awfully expensive for just making somebody think. You could write a column.
That's right. And to me, yes, that's right. And we've had this kind of invasion of criticality into opera, partly through the academic system, but not entirely. Just through the idea of critiquing works from within, to the idea of something as mundane as surtitles, or projecting text on a set or whatever, introducing the idea of the word that has to be translated through the eye into a thought process before you can receive the damn thing. And to me, and I believe, yes, in my old piece called The Diary of a Calf-Pag Madman, where I'm talking about Cavalleria and Pagliacci. And I talk about, and this is back in this, what was it, 1979, I think, somewhere in there. Now, Pagliacci is not what most people think of as one of the great thundering masterworks of it's not Tristan and Isolde, it's not Don Giovanni, it's not put on that plane. But what it does do is, if it's performed even just decently, it whacks you in the gut a bit. It gives you a strong emotional reaction. And when you have the strong emotional reaction, if you're a thoughtful person, if you aren't, you won't do this. You'll just go away with the feelings and say, wow, that was a hit. But if you are given to thought and analysis and self-examination or whatever, you will at some point say, why does that hit me that way? What is there about that reaches me? And you will begin to think about the piece and what it says and what it means. It's not a big, deep, profound, complicated piece. It's a right out there in your face piece. But nevertheless, there's something about it that must connect to something important in you for you to have that response to it. If you don't have that response to it, then that opera doesn't work for you. But anyway, in answer to Jennifer's question, I guess I'm in total agreement with her. It's not that I'm against thinking or against that isn't part of the nourishment and part of the use that we get from works of art. But works that are performed, especially. You can look at a great piece of sculpture or a great painting, and you can have an emotional response to it. But it's a different engagement. You're contemplating something automatically, right away. You're contemplating, you're analyzing a little bit, even as you receive whatever meaning or aesthetic pleasure there is in looking at it. In performance, as I guess we talked about some in the series also, performance tends to not let you do that, or at least it shouldn't let you do that. It should overwhelm that in the moment. It should go past that and force you to let down your defenses and your intellectual guard and just receive it. But once you've done that, there's plenty of stuff to think about. Mm-hmm. And that's where all of us who work in criticism at all have a field day. You can write about these pieces forever.
I want to bring us back to the details of vocality by way of two questions that are left over from last week, or last time we were together here on BCBC. And both are from people who are with us as well today. From Alexis Hins Morrow, there were several comments last time, one of which began, solutions, with exclamation point and a smiley. I think today's young opera lovers, and he names some of the others in this community, would be excited to hear some solutions for the future. And he also asks later, one second, well, he talks about audience building and a topic that includes cultural influences in childhood. And then there's another one that I would like to put with that from Derek Goff. This is not exactly in the form of a question, but I can turn it into one. The non-connoisseur loves the singer because they must be good if they're singing at the Met. Okay, we have all made fun of that at various times. But, says Derek, the connoisseur has to have some kind of sympathy, no matter how much the singer is struggling, because if the Met is going to put on the great works, who will sing at this point? And the question I infer from that, and Derek, you jump in here if I'm reading you wrong, but it does no good to say, oh my God, they can't perform, they don't have the cast for Die Meistersinger anymore, don't do it. They don't have the cast for Turandot anymore, don't do it. Isn't there a certain obligation to trust that even if we, remembering better casts of Meistersinger and Turandot, cannot enjoy those performances, someone who doesn't have our memories might enjoy them, and that might not be a worthless thing, that we might have to embrace a little in order to try to get back to a better place.
Sure. I don't think I argue against that at any point. And I'm a teacher. I work with singers all the time. I used to sing myself. I performed a lot as an actor. So I know very well what's involved in those things. And I'm on the side of the singer all the time as a listener and responder. However, in my capacity as a critic, I feel it's my responsibility to try to keep before my readers a sense of really where we are in relation to the potential of each work that we come across, what it is, not only what's there, which still may be of value, of course. I mean, when I think of some of the performances I went to when I was 12 years old, they were pretty ghastly. It didn't stop me from becoming excited by the idea of being at the opera. But that was in a different time. However ghastly they may have been, there wasn't any question about hearing it. or there being, you might hate what you heard. But hating is, my God, that's awful. What an ugly voice. What a pig. The things that people say, or that you just have, immediate visceral responses to. Nevertheless, that's an engaged response. It isn't just a looking at it and saying, oh, geez, or wait a minute, what's this supposed to be? So that idea of what it's supposed to be is, to me, when I write as a critic, something that I feel is my obligation to keep harping on, even though it may seem to be, somehow against the people who are trying to do this, which is never my intention. But
Right.
it is your absolute critical moral duty to try to assess as best you can, where is this in relation to what we know could be there, what we think the potential of that is, because if for no other reason, the people are not deceived. Turned away from the experience because it doesn't give them very much. That's what one of the things I always worry about. Yes, we're familiar, as Derek says, they must be good because they're at the Met. So people go to the Met and they hear them and it doesn't do anything for them. So they say, well, why should I buy another ticket? And I'm not saying that happens a lot, but I think it happens some, and there's always the danger of it happening. So that's the only distinction I would make. That's absolutely right, of course. I have sympathy both for, yes, go ahead.
Let me jump in. I want to jump in because both Derek and Alexis have said new things today that might be helpful in where we go next. One is, Alexis asks if you would name concisely the main qualities you feel are lacking in singers of the new vocality. I'm paraphrasing because it is already scrolled off the screen. And I want to throw that in with Derek said something that is related and that 3 people have already piped up to agree with. um, uh, which is the best voices end up in the premier training programs, which are run by people who champion the new vocality as being expressive, communicative, and real. So, what are those qualities? And what do we do with a system where the qualities that we all seem to agree from hearing the 2 minutes at the beginning are not so desirable? What do we do with a system where they seem, in fact, to be desired?
Yeah, well, to try to get to the first one first, I guess. The things I find most often missing in most of the voices that I listen to, we can put this in technical terms, but I'd rather just do it in perception terms. First of all, it sounds very, very basic, but it's basic but true, amplitude. The ability of the voice to fill the opera house with sound. It should be agreeable sound. It shouldn't be ugly. It shouldn't be forced, but it should do that job. Even if you're singing a very lyrical part, the singing should be of sufficient amplitude that it keeps the track of the music going from bottom to top, from soft to loud, and always feels like it's present, that you don't have to go to it. It's coming to you. And of course, in the big parts, the dramatic parts, it really should literally be the old phrase, a voice that fills the house. Didn't used to be such an uncommon thing. But that's number one. And that voice should be reasonably easily emitted. It should have an aesthetically appealing quality, and it should have within it dramatic potential. And that's a little bit where my taut lean thing comes in, because drama is created through oppositions. This is true in the drama of producing the tone itself. It's created by an elastic tensile set of balanced oppositions, not by a big, loose, open, floppy, even if your throat is open, emission. So there's a sense in those voices that a dramatic voice doesn't have to be huge. A dramatic voice, if it has that kind of sense of elasticity and tensile work by which the line of the music and the intent of the drama is etched in, rather than just kind of moved over, that will have a dramatic aspect to it. And with the big voices, it goes along with the sheer amplitude, a range of color. That it isn't always just bright, or it isn't always just dark, and the singer has at his or her disposal the means of using that variety for expressive dramatic purposes. I guess those would be the things that I find aren't there most of the time.
Okay, another comment has come in, another question has come in from Joshua Markovitz, alluding to a recent blog post by Conrad, in which he expresses a plea to contemporary singers. Do your best to fill in the little black ovals. Fill in all the little notes, vibrate all the sustained ones, string them all together, then we can follow you. By this, does he mean singing, quote, on the voice, with vibrato, on sustained breath impulses?
Yes.
Okay, Joshua,
That's
you
right.
read him right.
That's right. Retaining a constant engagement, never letting the engagement go. It may be softer, it may be louder, it may be brighter or darker, it may be moving fast, it may be slow and sustained, it may be florid, it may not be, any of those things, but you never cease that. And yes, of course, a periodicity of vibrato that can hear the tone is alive. The singer may choose to alter that sometimes for what he or she perceives to be dramatic purpose. If you want to produce a dead sound, you're Tristan at the beginning of Act 3, and you want to sound like you can hardly get out anything, croak anything, then you do something else with that, and maybe part of that is letting go of the vibrato for a little while, but you still keep it engaged. There are straight tones.
You really like the way Melchior sang the beginning of Act 3?
I know what you're getting at.
Well, that dead sound. You make me immediately think of, my head.
Yes.
I actually don't like the way he does that, so I just thought I'd ask you.
I fully understand why somebody might not like it. And of course, when he recorded that commercial, that was 1943, the broadcasts that I'm familiar with at least don't sound quite as much that way, so that may have been a function. But I think it was a choice that he made. It's not because he couldn't sing it with vibrato, if he wanted to. It was an interpretive choice that he made to sound close to death, barely able to intermittently get out some sound. And so I guess it's a matter of taste or a matter of your own connection, whether you feel that's effective or not. I grew up with it, so I guess I buy it. I guess I buy it. But of course, there would be other ways of doing that. It doesn't, but, yeah.
There's another one that has come in. I just have to scroll back because it's moving fast. Hang on.
Well, it's good. We have a conversation going.
There's a big conversation going on the side here. Well, I'm not finding it quickly, but as I am remembering it, it is about singers being told to sing legato all the time, even by people who like the new vocality. But the question, at least as I'm reading it, the implied question is, but how come they think this sort of easy come and go thing is legato? What isn't legato about that? If you could say, what isn't legato about that sort of easy, relaxed smoothness?
Sometimes there is what I would call a surface legato, just as there is what I would call a surface clarity to a lot of the, skip over types of singing. Yes, voice sounds clear. Yes, they're singing smoothly. But the element that's missing is precisely the one we were just talking about, that sense of laryngeal engagement to the support system that produces a tensile sound, even if it's a soft sound. It's also, it becomes a default style where people think that simply singing smoothly through everything is artistically, that fulfills the artistic expression of something. And it doesn't. It does some of the time in a lot of pieces, but legato means bound, legare, coming from the old Latin, the Roman soldiers' leg boots that were tied strong, that kept all the musculature together, that enabled you that supported your stride. That's what those were for, and that's where the word comes from, based way back etymologically. It doesn't mean just smooth, it means bonded. And whether it's engaged or not is the difference to me between whether it's just smooth or whether it is truly bonded. And we've discussed the mezza voce in relation to that. It's a sure tell,
So legato has to be not just the absence of interruptions, but the presence of active connection.
That's right. And you might say intention. the intention of proceeding on through toward a destination, not just gliding toward it, on a glide path kind of, but intentional guidance that never lets go toward whatever the targets are, musical and dramatic. We hope they're one.
Yes. Alexis jumps back in to ask, that active connection should be there even when singing staccato, correct?
Yes, of course. Yes, no matter what the articulation might be, marcato, martellato, staccato, whatever, or the phrase staccato that you see so often in Verdi. Yes, even if it's a disjunctive line, big skips, all of that. Underneath it always is the physical sostenuto. We may not hear it as such. We may hear but underneath that for the singer is a constant, ongoing, sustained engagement.
Jacob Gordon has just thrown into the chat the equivalent of a Molotov cocktail. The New Yorker, on Nina Stemme's most recent Met Isolde. Quote, her high notes burn through the orchestra. Her lower range has a dusky gleam. The singing was never less than beautiful. Close quote. And Jacob adds, are mainstream critics part of the problem?
That's a yes or no answer, and the answer is yes. I assume that's Alex Ross. Yes?
I think so.
Yes, indeed they are. That goes back to the question that Derek had asked a while ago. I didn't hear Nina Stemme do the Isolde here. I heard her do the one dolefully on the Tristan video from more recently. And I'm not against Nina Stemme. She's an artist, and I hope she succeeds. But that's part of what I mean. If you're promoting that performance, I shouldn't say this because I did not hear Nina Stemme do Isolde at the Met. So I can't really comment about that. I can only comment about my inferences from hearing her voice a few years ago, hearing her voice more recently. I'm assuming that report is highly inaccurate. And
I was at two performances of that run of Tristan and Isolde, so I don't have to have any of the caveats you have to have, but you are exactly correct that the report is extremely inaccurate.
There you go. So there's a person in one of the most important critical positions we have, as he himself points out. And I actually wrote a column devoted to Alex Ross's work a little while back because of his book. And he's super smart. He does lots of interesting stuff. But that is an extremely misleading thing to say about the performance of a great role in a great work. And if that's what people are being instructed by, if that's what they're being directed toward, there's a beautiful performance of Isolde with shining high notes or whatever. That's bad criticism. And that's what I try to avoid in answer talking with Derek a while back. That's part of what I mean. It's a critic's obligation to describe what is in fact the case. And there has to be some standard about that.
I would say it's a betrayal of the reader, because if you're saying to someone, this is the height of glorious Wagner singing, and the reader sits through it and says, I didn't enjoy myself very much, then in effect you have instructed him to think that there is no reason to spend more of his time with Wagner or the singing of Wagner, because really, if that's all there is there, maybe I should go to a movie.
Precisely, of course. And the movie's a lot cheaper, and now you can stream it. So, or you can hear Nina Stemme sing Isolde streaming if you want to, and pay a lot less. And whatever. But yes, that's right. I mean, that's where I think that's where the critic's obligation comes in.
The critics, don't you think, though, there's also the critics are all running scared because their jobs are being eliminated at an even greater clip than the competent Verdi baritones are being eliminated. There are well, okay. Come see, come stop. But I mean, I detect in reading critics, including some critics that I know to be potentially competent, critics who have the listening experience that ought to equip them to do better than they are doing, but they seem to have made a conscious decision that their role in the world is to be the cheerleader for a threatened art, and therefore they must say it is good whether it is or not. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I think that happens on you read between the lines with a lot of people, and some of them truly don't know. To me, I really have a question about Alex Ross. I don't think he knows how to listen to singing. And I think I see that over and over. This would be an example, but far from the only one. So you can't expect him to do this job. But yes, the critics are becoming the way we used to think of small town critics needing to be, small town reviewers. We must, we've got this poor little opera company in our town, or this orchestra in our town, or whatever it might be, and aren't we fortunate to have it? And it can barely survive, and it's tied in with civic pride and civic life and the community's life in very important ways. So if you're in the position of reviewing under circumstances like that, you can't be bombing in like John Simon or somebody and just obliterating all of the efforts that those people are making. Right, you can't do that. So you have to withdraw your actual critical perception. For heaven's sake, the Cleveland Plain Dealers critic got himself fired by constant complaints about Franz Welser Must in a big city. And I don't know whether I agree with him or not, but he was simply putting forth his critical evaluation of this conductor. And so there you are, you're kind of stuck. The conductor's going to be there all the time. Every night you go back and there he is. And you're having to write something about him. But that's in a pretty big city. Now people are starting to think, and yes, the art form is under great threat. That's certainly true. And its institutions are under threat. Also true. So does that mean that criticism should just go away, or that criticism must become a little arm of the marketing or the promotional aspect? And yeah, I know I know that about some people too. I know they know better, but they don't write it.
I would like to think that a critic deserving of a post at a major publication like the New Yorker should have the sophistication and the writing chops to achieve a contextual view, to say what needs to be said, but not to say it in the form of a stormtrooper attack, because there is, in fact, not another opera company down the road presenting Melchior and Flagstad that you can say, this clearly superior thing deserves my reader's allegiance. Instead, you have to find some way to be the advocate for the art form being true to itself.
That's
not
right.
to be the advocate for the presenters of the art form, but to be the advocate for the art form as it might exist.
I think exactly that, yes.
Joshua brings in, does Conrad think that celebrating Callis, once she had tragically lost her voice, but not her artistry, devalues the voice?
I think it depends on what form the celebration takes. She was a great artist. For a time, the singing was good enough that the great artistry was manifest and was there. And one should never lose sight of that or fail to celebrate that. On the other hand, this is exactly another of the critical distinctions in her voice from early on. I'm not sure I can say from the very beginning because I didn't hear that, but from early on, there were clear technical faults in the voice that were apt to lead to difficulties as the career went on. You always have to be respectful of the fact that you're trying to separate out those problems from any of the many others that might have been in her life, the other things that were going on, and her temperament, and all kinds of other things. It's not just the technique that we're talking about, but it is in part, and to the extent that one can discuss those things and connect them to what happened to her voice and therefore to her artistry. Because you can say the artistry was still there, but if you can't convey it through the voice, it might as well not be. And so that would be precisely one of the critics' jobs, would be to identify and celebrate everything about her work that was on a genius level and that did what other people didn't do, couldn't do. But to always keep in mind also that this is a mortal person who's using her voice in certain ways, and there are other things just besides her reputation at stake. There is also, what do young people listening to her think? What are they taking her as a model? Are they taking things in the way she sang, including some of those faults, as the way they should sing? There are all of those things. Some of the singers we could name did so. Many others. So, I mean, to me, again, it's a distinction that you have to make. There's no reason to run down Maria Callas as a great artist. There is every reason, however, to point to the things and try to define them, try to make other people hear them. Maybe they don't agree with you. Maybe they have a totally different technical take on it anyway. And if they know enough to write about it from their point of view or to talk, then they should. It's not that you don't brook disagreement, but whatever you as a professional hearer of voices and worker with voices are hearing, you're supposed to talk about that. You're supposed to say that. Whether you think it adds to or detracts from the reputation of the artist, that's not the critic's responsibility.
Conrad, I wonder, we may have gone past one of, I think it was Alexis's questions before getting all the way through it. The list of things that are missing in the new vocality singer, and I don't remember you arriving at the specific point of chest voice engagement, but I know that would be on your list because of how much you talk about it in the book and how much I have heard and learned from you about it over the years. Referring back to that 2-minute horror show at the beginning, one thing that struck me hearing it again after I had put it together, I actually think I may have overemphasized this part, and maybe I could put in a few different things if we ever do this again. But the thing that really struck me is that those second examples of all those pieces just seem as though they are breathing on their head voice almost all the time. Can you say something more about that aspect of the new vocality?
Sure. Yes, there's no question that the engagement that we've been talking about, laryngeal energization, whatever, implied in that, implicit in that, I think, is the presence of chest voice. The positional things that the singer derives for use throughout the range. not the registrational things, the positional things, the grounding of where the voice is coming from, is contacted most easily and first of all in the chest side of the voice, in both sexes. And it's identifiable originally. Often it has a kind of a rawness or roughness to it. It's not always musically wonderful or pretty when you first contact it. But if you have a constantly engaged laryngeal energization connected to the support system, and you run up and down the range, most particularly, of course, through the passaggio area, but that would be included in running up and down the range, you're going to come across chest voice. You're only not going to come across it if you're disengaged. One of the contrasts, left-right contrast that we had on the chart that you had up at the beginning of this talk, Will, was between Lucrezia Borri on one side, Anna Maffo on the other side. Borri, whose high notes are sometimes in some question. You can aesthetically not care for some of her high notes, a little glary, a little straight or whatever, but everything else in the voice under total tensile control. And although her voice was not a dramatic voice, it was a lyrical voice for sure, the chest voice is constantly present anywhere from the center of the passaggio area on down. Even when she sings softly, you hear that little tensile, light chesty thing in the sound. Anamorpho, nothing. Beautiful, beautiful, warm sound of generous enough size as a lyric soprano. She could sing a Violetta, a Mimi, a Liu in the opera house. You didn't not hear her. And there was a lot of beautiful, wonderful stuff in it. She comes down to E flat or D or lower, and there is simply nothing there to receive the energy. The voice is not engaged. So another way of putting that is no chest voice. There's nothing to receive the energy when she gets down there to the bottom. Borri had a long career which went through a period of vocal an operation, a time of having to be silent and recover, came back, had another, 20 years after that. Moffo collapsed pretty early on and did not fulfill all the potential of that really beautiful instrument when she was singing at her best. So that's, if I may take that as just an example. So you can put it either way. You can say if you have this constant engagement and it's there, energized, connected to the support system, chest voice is going to come in. It's your job as a teacher, if you are a teacher, to see to it that when it's come in, you find a way of equalizing it with the rest of the voice, that it doesn't just come in as a raw function, that it becomes musical and becomes integrated with the rest of the voice to make up a bonded together range. And the absolute, not just absence by default, but the absolute positive instruction to a lot of young singers now to not do that. Don't engage with that. That actually is taught. Never use the chest voice. Or if you do, engage it very, very, very lightly, because don't worry, you'll have to worry about taking it up. Yes, you have to learn to deal with that. That's what part of the singer's job is, what part of the teacher's job is. And it's just as applicable in male voices. A lot of the lighter, even a couple of the examples you played, Will, the Malatesta line, a couple of the others. Yes, you hear the utter absence of that kind of engagement which would imply stronger chest register involvement in the overall balance of the voice. And of course, with a baritone, most of the voice lies below the center of the passaggio area. So one would think the usual problem would be, how on earth do we get high notes with a voice that's mostly on the chest side? But instead, the problem is, how do we make it sound anything other than wimpy? Anyway, did I answer the question?
Yes, and now there is a very lively debate taking place in the chat that I'm going to skip part of it, but I'm going to pick up one part that where two people have sort of joined forces here. Dave Ekstrom was asking, where does the idea of avoiding chest voice even come from? Because he says he has yet to find a pedagogical book that says directly to avoid it, and yet we all know. First of all, just from the facts on the ground, so many people are avoiding it, and we further know anecdotally that some people are telling them to avoid it. Then, Alexis says, how does the current state of affairs with opera in this country compare with Europe? And he mentions his family is from Germany, his or her family. I'm not sure if Alexis is a male or female name here, but anyway, how does their family is from Germany, and it's easy to feel the cultural differences between the U.S. and Europe, but not quite sure how this trickles down into the opera world, and would love your thoughts on that. And then Stephen Tharp jumps in to say that he thinks that the no chest voice thing actually started with German pedagogues. That there is a German ancestry here for the avoidance of chest voice. So I put all of that onto your plate.
All right, okay. I think first of all, when I was young and studying voice, and that was in the middle of the era that I talked about a little while ago, the era from the end of the Second World War up until 1970. That's when I was studying, that's when I was doing the singing that I did do. And we had examples before us of chest causing train wrecks. We had big mezzos driving the voices up, or we had Germanic basses bellowing on nothing but a kind of a straight chest-oriented tone all the way up to F or whatever. Not pleasant, and there were incidences of that, and teachers got very gun-shy about that, about not wanting to lead somebody into that sort of difficulty, and that's a legitimate question. That there is misuse of chest voice, or at least the failure to sufficiently integrate it with the rest of the voice, and consequently the technique suffers and the voice suffers. So that's right. So that's a part of it from back then. But then if you think about the kinds of influences that have been coming into operatic singing since, part of them, we think about the academic side of things, where the teacher has the obligation of at least preserving the person's voice and meeting jury requirements and seeing the person through. I mean, first do no harm is a teacher's maxim as much as it is a doctor's. So yes, and you have to work within whatever parameters you're working with. So you have to meet whatever requirements there are to meet. So, and I'm not pinning this all on the academic thing. It's just as true, I think, in independent voice teaching these days. But look, it's hard to do. It's you bring in that function, and in the skip over techniques, of course, in people who are singing Baroque music or early classical music in the way that we have inferred they should be sung. I don't know whether that's accurate or not, but that's what's happened. Or a lot of the kinds of contemporary music that are so dependent on slender, clear sounds with, whatever. If you intrude with strong chest voice function, strong laryngeal engagement in those practices, the effect is going to be very disruptive. It's going to throw the voice out of kilter. So people being trained in those techniques are going to shy away from it. Mm-hmm. It will disturb what they're trying to arrive at. And I keep going back to the ways we talk, the ways we conduct our lives in general, vocally speaking, the voices we hear on television, all of this. Have I lost the thread here a little bit? As to why the chest voice, yeah, I think it's partly teachers making sure that they're not harming somebody, that they're not, and that they're not bringing in an element that they don't know how to handle, and that can't be handled within the parameters they're given. If you aren't allowed to pursue that, or don't feel that you're allowed to pursue it, or don't feel that you're capable of pursuing it and then arriving at an outcome, and that you must preserve the person's voice and be safe about it, you're unlikely to dive into this very much. And you don't have many models to point to. Mm-hmm. You can't tell your student, go down to the Met tonight, or buy this recording, or listen to this broadcast to hear somebody doing this, doing it well, and doing it healthily, and having a good result with it, and producing an exciting result. You don't have that very much to be able to instruct people with. So where are you? And the question about Europe. I haven't spent enough time there or even listened to enough stuff coming from there in recent years to have any definitive take on any of this. But the times that I have been there, which has been mostly in Italy, actually, not in Germany, or the contact that I have with my friend Thomas Prochaska in Vienna, who writes an ongoing blog and has a lot of grief as a result of doing so, because he keeps pointing out there are two things not happening. One is real legato, one is chest voice. And according to his reporting and the things he sends me as examples and other things, we can all get them off of stuff that's streaming. It's just as bad in Europe, and I don't know exactly why. And Steve's observation, I think, has some merit. I guess I don't know if I've talked about this in any of our video things or not, but I have a copy of Pauline Viardot's Une heure d'étude. And it was owned obviously, by a young German student, German or Austrian, Germanic culture student, back in the day. This is a book I bought back in the 50s from a store that used to specialize in this stuff. And I looked through it, and Viardot has many exercises for showing about moving through the break, always from below, incidentally, which is kind of curious, which is always talking about a piena voce, up through E and F sharp and beyond. And she gives vowels, open vowels, ah, eh. The student who owned the book, and who clearly is German because she has little things scribbled in the margins and stuff, and she uses umlauts on things. And she's taken those exercises, and obviously under somebody's instruction, has substituted oo for ah, and has brought in Kopfstimme action into exercises that were designed to keep you grounded in the chest positioning as you move through the register change. Viardot intended that. This student is intending to do this to get up through the register change. So I think, yes, and of course I remember my first teacher, the same one who worked all the Stauprinzip stuff with him that he derived from the great pedagogue Armin back in the interwar time, but also used almost, not exclusively, of course. I mean, we vocalized on the Italian vowels, but he also introduced a lot of work on the umlaut vowels, U and Ö, and particularly when trying to work in softer sounds into what was essentially a more gripped kind of position. So that an ideal of getting a kind of a mix into the voice that derived from those head-dominated vowel forms. So I suspect, Steve, that you're onto something with that. And even if you listen back, for example, I've written a lot about Lotte Lehmann and how she engaged the chest register as she went down through it and then came back up, which to me is almost ideal within the context of her general way of singing. Those are beautiful balances, beautiful blends. The voice rolls back and forth with no difficulty whatsoever in the context of her basic vocal setup. But that's different from the way an Italian teacher would have taught it in the same era. And it's a different sounding chest voice. It is definitely on the chest side, no question. But it's blended in a different way. It's much more blended from the top down into the lower voice very successfully. And that is where most of the integration finally has to be done from. You are not going to get it happening from the chest up very successfully. But an Italian teacher would have taught differently. It would have taught the grounding in the chest differently, with a greater clarity, a more open kind of vowel sound. It would have related to the middle part of the voice differently.
And after all, they don't have the umlauts.
That's right. That's right.
I mean,
That's right.
Language and its sounds are a big part of what makes our different vocal traditions.
That's a huge part. That's right. That's right.
I have been given the signal that we should wind it up, which I totally don't feel like doing, but all good things must come to an end. So, Rochelle, am I supposed to turn it back over to you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want it to end either. And more than that, I wish for us to keep on thinking about ways to reach a wider audience. And I think one of the things that I'm interested in knowing from people here, if you want to email us, and I'll talk to Will and Conrad as well, is how do we engage different parts of our community? You know, there's one thing like teaching singers to sing with chest voice again, and, you know, but how do we engage the rest of the community, which is what we very much try to do here. We are planning talking to young composers, which you guys might be interested in asking, what can we ask the voice to do? So that's one thing I have been thinking would be an interesting way in, is like, what are you thinking is going to come out of a soprano's voice if you write fortissimo on C5? That is, you know, because you see that kind of thing. And I think that might be an interesting way in with young composers, say, like, if you write something or if you imagine something, where do you write that? How are voices put together? So I'd be interested to know what people in this conversation think about, you know, what other ways can we spread this very important gospel? And of course, I'm sure everybody wants to know when Will and Conrad will come back. And so I will take that and I will send that email and ask if they, in the new year at some point, want to continue. I personally think it's a conversation that we cannot afford to ever stop, because it's important for us to have it if we believe in the future of our art form. Yeah, great composers. We engaged with Matt O'Coin. Matt O'Coin was with us last Sunday, and he's interested in partnering with us. So please join me in saying a huge thank you to Will and Conrad. Raise your hand, please, again, virtually, if you want to continue doing this and want me to beg them on your behalf. to come back. They might get tired of me. Oh, there goes the hands. Find your button. I couldn't find my raised hand. Lots of raised hands. I very much appreciate both of your time and coming to join us. I know everybody is busy, and I am so appreciative of you sharing your time with us. We will hopefully see you next week with Stephen for some listening. I think that is a huge thing we discovered in the chat as well, right? Many people say, if we don't have the right goal in our ear, how do we know what it is we're listening to, or what do we aspire to when we sing or when we teach? So our listening on Sundays is hugely important. Thank you all for great 2021. I will see you next Sunday. Bye-bye.